Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us Javier Perez, Open Source Program Manager of IBM Z and LinuxONE. Javier, first of all, it's nice to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is actually not a bad pun when you look at mainframe, right? So if you look at mainframe and if you look at the whole history, I still actually remember the IBM ad about Linux. The small kid running. So every time I talk, it makes me nostalgic. But these two had been a kind of separate word, but with the IBM Z and Linux One platform. First, I think if I'm not wrong, Ubuntu came, and then other distribution also start coming up. So first of all, what I want to know is that how did you see the change within the culture of mainframe when you started seeing these open source distribution started coming out and where developers and customers started using them? How did the culture change?
Yeah, I mean, do we have 2 hours to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean,
It's actually a very interesting story. Mainframes, started in the 1950s, right? So we're now 70 years with mainframes. And there's actually records that we started with open source back in the 1950s, right? An organization called Share, and which, by the way, is still around. And they had a conference just a few weeks ago. Where people were just sharing the software, everything they were doing on mainframes, and they got together and started sharing some of that work, right? So we can trace open source back then. We just actually celebrated the 20 years of Linux on the mainframe, or Linux on IBM Z, and that's also a very interesting story where back then, back in the 90s, on the mid 90s. It was all about Unix, right? Not Linux, but Unix, and pretty much driven by all the hardware vendors, right? You remember we had Sun Solaris, and we had HPUX, and we had, of course, AIX, right? The IBM's Unix. So in the spirit of open source, a group of engineers within IBM said, well, hey, why not bring in Linux to the mainframe? By the way, Java, becoming popular in the mid 90s or in the late 90s, and say, well, let's bring Java to the mainframe. Let's bring it on Linux, and let's take the open source distribution and let's go all open source. And since then, it's been 20 years. It's been 20 years of the use of Linux on mainframes, which means all the evolution of the hardware side of things, which we keep releasing every couple of years. All that evolution happens with Linux, and that means that our ecosystem of open source software keeps growing, right? So it's just like any other platform just based on Linux, and a lot of open source out there.
Right. One more thing, I think when we look at Linux and the enterprise, I think it was not just Linux. A lot of enterprise application, like especially Oracle database and everything, when they started supporting Linux, that's when Linux started to become a kind of favorite of enterprise users, because the desktop or distribution itself had no value there. Okay, that's good, that history that you shared. Now, just move to 2021. If you look at mainframe today, we talk about, all those microservices, cloud, and what role is mainframe playing in today's economy?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, since we have the same infrastructure now we're talking, when people talk about cloud, well, that's just another platform. You can have your private cloud, you can have your on-premise cloud, or you can have your dedicated cloud, or you can have it public. By the way, IBM with the IBM Cloud also has a service that it's based on the mainframe architecture. It's also known as a hyperprotect service. So, all the software is out there, right? You probably heard about that small acquisition of Red Hat just over a year ago. Well, now most of the software it's available. OpenShift, all containers, Kubernetes. You can have any type of modern application, APIs, containers, orchestration of containers, microservices, all in just another platform, which happens to be high-performant platform, right? Really, really fast with high capacity.
One more thing, I was talking to Elizabeth Joseph, and I'm a fan of the work she's doing. And she, at one point, she was saying that mainframe has solved all the problems that today cloud, with whether it's networking, whether it's storage, it was solved 20 years ago that we are trying to solve in the cloud native world. So when you talk about Red Hat and you talk about all these Kubernetes, all kind of workloads, talk a bit about uh, how is mainframe, because when we look at mainframe, no pun intended, we are looking at a monolith, but we are talking about the workloads which are more or less like DevOps centric. So how do you enable developers bring their own workflow into the mainframe so that they can continue to leverage the application they use, and then they can reap benefits from mainframe?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of advances, improvements. Actually, most of that open source technology that helps you kind of integrate modern technologies like DevOps tooling into the mainframe. One thing to remember when we talk about Linux is the same Linux everywhere, right? But when you're using Linux on a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino project, you have to have a Linux that is compiled on that platform, right? On that processor architecture. It's the same thing with mainframes, right? The processor architecture is called the S390X, just like if it's x86 or Power or ARM64, you just need a Linux distribution that is compiled on that platform. And the same goes for the software, right? So if you want to port or bring up a software that works today on x86, well, you have to build it or compile it, depending on the programming language, on the platform, and then you are up and running. One thing that you mentioned about all these technologies happening, it's been years from mainframe, right? Things like separation of workloads. That's something that has been going on in the mainframe technology for many, many years, right? And that's what we have today on public clouds, right? Just this multi-tenant and separation of workloads. We on the mainframe side, that problem has been resolved. Actually, even the use of containers very early on. 20 years ago, one of my first jobs was on the billing systems, and all the processing, all the billing on every month on the billing was done on a mainframe, right? Well, guess what? That still happens today, right? Most of financial institutions, most of the payrolls and high processing mission critical applications are done on these more modern mainframes today. And yes, there's still some COBOL over there. There's still some COBOL, and there's some really good initiatives around COBOL actually.
Yeah, the fun fact is that without realizing, in our one day's life, if we had done any kind of transaction, we have been through a mainframe without even realizing that. So yeah, you're right about that. Now, so we have talked about the history. We talked about how mainframe is kind of allowing these DevOps to be able to bring their own workload into that. Looking at the history, looking at the current situation, what kind of trend do you see? We cannot talk about too much far in future, but still, what kind of trend do you see? What kind of adoption you're seeing when it comes to these open source cloud native technologies with mainframe that you will see that is changing the way a mainframe is interacting with the developers, or developers are interacting with mainframe?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously many signs on trends, right? Especially in the development environment. We see things, I see open source, to continue to grow, right? As absolutely mainstream open source across all platforms. When you see IBM acquiring Red Hat or Microsoft acquiring GitHub, I mean, that's a sign that it's really mainstream, all open source, and it's going to continue to grow. Now, the trend that I see in a few years, really, it's more about companies, more of everyone is using open source, everyone is kind of using downstream open source, but it's more on the, how much more they are going to start contributing, right? What we call contributing upstream. You see companies that today, some companies are, especially technology companies, that are putting all their code out there, right? It's in public repositories, it's out there, come and help us, or, if you detect a problem, an error, a bug, help us contribute back or let us know. Companies like Netflix, which are obviously on a very unique space. Most of their software is out there, it's in the public, and I work for places where we took some of their open source software that had nothing to do with the streaming video, but to use those technologies. So I think that trend is going to continue regardless of the underlying platforms. It's all open source. Most of them, it's based on Linux, right?
Yeah, I think you're talking about Asgard, which now is Spinnaker. I think IBM took a right, if I'm not wrong, because Asgard was for CI/CD that Netflix work internally, and then they open source it, and now it's becoming Spinnaker, and this, yeah.
And it's part of the Linux Foundation now, and there's a lot more contributions there. Yeah.
This is not even a question, but I would ask just for the benefit of our users, viewers, is that, of course, IBM is doing a lot of work in the open source space. Not everybody wants to talk about it all the time, and because open source has kind of become the preferred, if not the default software development model for most companies. But there is also a project called Open Mainframe, which is, to bring new developer get excited about mainframe, whether it's improving the interface. There are other things that they're working on. That's where the whole focus of the project is. How much involvement is there in this, and what value do you see in attracting new developers towards mainframe? Because if you look at mainframe crowd, it is a very mature crowd.
It is. There are a number of initiatives. The one that comes to mind immediately is, bringing startups to use mainframes, right? There are so many startups out there on the data science space, right? With major data loads, data warehouses. Obviously, a lot of startup in the AI space, in machine learning, deep learning, and why not using a high-performance platform, right, like mainframe, to do all that processing? Another point is the fact that, since most or many of the mission-critical applications processing very, very large volumes of data are already on the mainframe, why going and transfer that data somewhere else to do some AI or machine learning, right, or maybe some analytics? Why not using it on the same platform? So we've seen a lot of that. I think that's growing, and I think it's going to go. It's going to get to a point where it's just another platform, right? Just like it's just another cloud. It's just another place where you have your data. And by the way, today, if you log into one of our LinuxONE community clouds, you are on the command line. You don't even notice where you are. It's just another Linux command line.
Yeah, that's another thing, that if you look at mainframe, it's an expensive. I cannot have it in my basement, right? Just the way I can have a server. How do you make mainframe more accessible? Because startups, they don't have all the resources for overhead cost. So that's where your LinuxONE cloud also comes into the picture. But that is, I think, more targeted towards developers community, not at the consumers, customers. Can you talk about the resources that are there?
Yeah, look, there are many ways to start up, to get a trial, actually, we have something like 14, 16 options for different type of trials. And I am actually on another project at the moment to formalize a more permanent access, right? Especially for all those open source projects. I'm very interested to bring them there. But talking about the cost, and I want to make this point. I work for a couple of startups, small, well-funded startups. I also work for mid-sized companies. I think with the startups, we were spending more than $1 million on cloud services, public cloud services a year, right? More than $1 million, just a startup, not talking about mid-sized companies or large organizations. I work for a mid-sized organization where, we had a meeting every month that the topic was, how do we control the cloud cost? All right, because it just goes off the roof, because you can very easily spin another VM and you get more containers and cost goes up. So when we talk about that cost, the use of platform like a mainframe is just comparable or even less.
No, if you look at, I don't want to name any company, but if you look at the cost of public cloud, if you stack it up over years, it really becomes much more expensive.
It is.
But it's all about perception. Hey, you know what? You can just put your credit card there, you got it. But you have to look at long term also, for how much you keep, paying for everything that is running there.
It is millions and millions of dollars for most companies, I have to say. Right? So it's amazing. It's just, talks about the success of public cloud.
So are you seeing any, let me rephrase probably, are you seeing any increased interest in mainframe? Are you doing any kind of programs to educate startups or other such companies to leverage mainframe? Can you talk about if there are any such efforts?
I know IBM has a very successful program with startups. I believe we reach 50 startups, maybe more now, using LinuxONE. Definitely the advocacy, the promoting the platform, it's an area that we're working on, that it has room for improvement. That's pretty much part of my job, promoting open source, looking and explaining, educating people, right? I go to events, webinars, and tell, that LOL image that you had about the mainframe, it's not like that, right? And by the way, I was going to tell you about the commercial that you mentioned at the beginning. I just tweeted that or retweeted that commercial just like a couple of days ago, talking about the 20 years. Actually, that was from a Super Bowl in 2003 or 5, something like that. Yeah.
When we look at mainframe, as we talked about earlier, we are talking about some very, not necessarily maybe mission critical, but very serious, we are talking about transaction. So when you look at, established mainframe, everything has been taken care of. But when we look at a lot of these new, technology, new workload, they are still trying, like security is becoming a serious topic within the cloud native community. Earlier, it used to be an afterthought, but now there are so many projects, there is so many consolidation happening within the security industry. So that also means that those challenges are still there for this community, cloud native community, they are trying to solve. So when we look at mainframe, what are the challenges that you see that are coming to mainframe with these new open source technologies that are coming there, which you are actively working on solving, or which are your concern at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, security, it's been a major item, a major feature for mainframes over the years. Actually, in the last couple of years, there've been some significant enhancements on security and cryptography, from firmware, from hardware level to software level. Mentioned earlier the separation of workflows and other features. They make the mainframe really resilient. You might know this IBM Z. The Z is because it's for zero downtime, right? Mm-hmm. You don't reboot the mainframe, right? It's very reliable, and that's one of the reasons that it's been going on for so many years. But keeps advancing and keeping the backwards compatibility, which in some cases some can argue, well, that's also slowing us down in terms of technology. But security is a key area. I actually have a couple of sessions. I have one webinar coming to talk about open source security, and regardless of how much you can encrypt and on transit or at rest, or in between. I don't know if you heard about that homomorphic encryption that we recently released. Regardless of how much you can do, if someone gets in, like if a bad guy gets in through phishing or stolen password or you name it, if you have vulnerabilities on your software, you might get exploited. You might get an exploit there. So there are a number of things that you can do to keep you safe or control the security on your open source libraries, on your open source software.
Yeah, the thing with security is that it's a cat and mouse game, because the people who exploit security, they're smart people. They are some of the smart people. And the issue is that you have to be right all the time if you're protecting your system, and they have to be right only one time, and that's all it takes. So the scale is tilted in their favor, that they have to be right one time, and that's what it all takes. So security is tough to do. And coming back to IBM Z, I was just curious why they named LinuxONE. Does that mean that there can be one downtime? It should be Linux Z, right?
Well, look, the first time I heard it, I thought that must be an IBM version of Linux, and it's not. It was designed. One of the things that you can do on mainframes is you can have multiple operating systems. right? Traditional ZOS or VMS and Linux. So they decided actually exactly 5 years ago. We were celebrating the 20 years of Linux and then 5 years of LinuxONE. Decided to bring a model only for Linux. So it's only for Linux, and it was designed just for Linux, and then the name LinuxONE.
Yeah, I know that's what it is, a Z versus one. Anyway, Javier, thank you so much for taking your time out today from your busy schedule and talk about not only Mainframe, but also because we don't hear much about when we talk about startups, everybody talks about, hey, just put your credit card there, get a cloud instance and be done. But talking about how you're helping them leverage all these mainframe technologies as well. And as you said, there are a lot of things in the pipeline. So I would love to talk about them as well. So I would love to have you again on the show. But for today, thank you so much.
Thank you.